Can biological evolution account for the history of life on Earth, for the diversity of life that we see today? Many evolutionary biologists argue that there's overwhelming evidence for macroevolution, and that evidence comes primarily from the fossil record. But yet, when we look at the fossil record, we see that the fossil record doesn't look like we would expect it to look. If evolution indeed accounts for the history of life on Earth, we would expect to see a gradual evolutionary history unfolding in the fossil record, with an innumerable number of transitional forms documenting the transformation of one major group into another major group. And we would see this over and over and over again. Yet what we see when we look at the fossil record is an absence of transitional forms. In fact, Darwin recognized this when he wrote his book on the origin of species. He had a number of chapters devoted to problems with this theory, and one of the problems Darwin noted is this. By this theory, according to Darwin, his theory of evolution, innumerable transitional forms must have existed. Why do we not find them embedded in countless numbers in the crust of the Earth? And in fact, this problem that Darwin recognized then persists today. Stephen Jay Gould, the late evolutionary biologist and scientist from Harvard University, said this: "All paleontologists know that the fossil record contains precious little in the way of intermediate forms. Transitions between major groups are characteristically abrupt." And so the fact here is this: the fossil record does not support the evolutionary paradigm. It doesn't look like we'd expect it to look if indeed biological evolution is true. Yet evolutionary biologists are not deterred by these problems. They argue that this simply reflects the incompleteness of the fossil record. And they like to point to examples of transitional forms that they argue do indeed document macroevolutionary changes. Two of the examples of transitional forms that I want to talk about that are prominently discussed by evolutionary biologists, that are in some biology textbooks, are the so-called fissiopods and the origin of whales. The so-called fissiopods refer to transitional forms that presumably document the first appearance of animal life on land, where lobe-finned fishes undergo a series of transitional forms, producing ultimately the very first land vertebrates. These would be amphibian-type creatures. And so presumably the first amphibians on the land were Acanthostega and Ichthyostega, again, organisms that look like salamanders, very large salamanders in appearance. And these transitional forms that supposedly document the transformation of a lobe-finned fish to, again, Acanthostega and Ichthyostega are referred to lovingly by evolutionary biologists as the fissiopods. Now, if the fissiopods are documenting an evolutionary transformation, however, we would expect that this transformation would occur over a vast period of time, because we're going from organisms that live in an aquatic environment to organisms that can exist on the land. And the amount of change that has to happen anatomically and physiologically to accommodate this type of transformation is enormous. And we'd expect that this transformation would take place over a vast period of time. But instead what we see is that the time from the very first appearance of the lobe-finned fish that everybody thinks gave rise to the tetrapods, and the emergence of the very first tetrapod on land is on the order of about 10 million years. It's a very rapid transition going from water to land, which makes me suspicious that evolution is the way to explain this particular transition. Moreover, all of the fissiopods appear at the same time in the fossil record. In other words, they coexist, they overlap, they don't appear in a sequential manner if indeed you are documenting a clear evolutionary transformation. And then finally, the sequence of events in the fishapod fossil record is out of order. For example, Panderichthys is considered to be one of the very first fishapods, very closely related to lobe-finned fish. But when scientists examine the forelimbs of Panderichthys, it actually has digits. It doesn't have fins, it has digits. On the other hand, Tiktaalik, which is supposed to be this perfect midpoint between a lobe-finned fish and a tetrapod, actually has fins on its forelimbs. It doesn't have digits. In other words, things are out of order. We also see the same thing for Ventostega. It's considered to be a rather primitive fishapod, but yet it's rather late appearing in the sequence. Again, out of order, where a more primitive form appears later, not earlier in the sequence. And then finally, scientists have discovered footprints that have been made in the mud that date at 400 million years ago, recovered from Poland just recently. And these footprints are made by Acanthostega and Ichthyostega. Based on the pattern of the footprints and the nature of the imprints, they could conclude that a tetrapod made these. What's interesting is that according to the fossil record, tetrapods don't appear on land until 365 million years ago, and that the transition from a lobe-finned fish to tetrapods begins at 385 million years ago. In other words, we already see evidence for some kind of amphibian on the land well before the transition begins according to the fossil record. The fact that we see things out of sequence is troubling. The fact that we're seeing transitional forms appearing after the forms they are supposedly evolving into in the fossil record is known as a temporal paradox by scientists. And this temporal paradox characterizes the origin of tetrapods. Now, when it comes to the origin of whales, we see again a similar type of problem. Supposedly whales evolved through a series of transitional forms, beginning with some kind of wolf-like creature, Pakicetus, that then evolves through a series of transitional forms to give rise to the first true whales. All this happening in the neighborhood of about 55 million years ago. But just like with the origin of tetrapods, we see that this transition takes place very rapidly in a range of 10 million years or less, and that we have transitional forms that co-occur in the fossil record. They don't appear in a sequential manner. And this, again, is troubling from an evolutionary perspective. It's a pattern that you would not expect to see if indeed these were transitional forms. So then how do we explain these forms that seem to be well adapted to live at the water's edge, whether they're fishapods or supposedly transitional forms leading up to the origin of whales? Well, again, I would argue that these are well-designed organisms, perfectly suited to live at the water's edge. And I would view them as being creatures that were created by God, that existed in this environment and then later disappeared. And that whales were created through God's direct intervention, as well were the first vertebrates on the land, the first tetrapods. And so again, these transitional forms are actually well-designed creatures that live at the water's edge, where scientists are imposing a pattern on this data because they look at this from an evolutionary vantage point, with that perspective, with that bias in play. So how do we make sense of these so-called transitional intermediate forms that are found in the fossil record from a creation model perspective? Well, to appreciate that, we need to introduce a concept known as mosaic designs. These are designs that essentially represent a blending of the properties or characteristics or features of two designs. So when we look at these organisms that existed at the water's edge, they're mosaic organisms that display properties and characteristics that represent a blending of aquatic organisms and terrestrial organisms, bringing together the best features of both designs to produce organisms that are ideally suited, again, to live at the water's edge. We could see these as examples of the work of a creator, not the outworking of evolutionary processes. Let me illustrate this with an example of a mosaic design that probably almost everybody's familiar with, particularly if you like to eat at certain fast food restaurants. And that example would be a spork. This, of course, is an implement that has the properties of both a spoon and a fork. Whoever produced this object felt like this would be an ideal implement to help people eat certain types of foods, bringing together, again, the best properties of a spoon and a fork. When you look at the spork, you think this is the work of a designer. You don't think that this is a transitional intermediate documenting the transformation of a spoon into a fork. Instead, you recognize this as the work of a designer. And this brings us to the final point that I want to make today, and that is this, that many of the features that we see in the fossil